So did everybody get their email? Now, I found this very interesting. Switch her up a little bit. Did everybody get their email from Florida Realtors with their new compensation riders? I found this interesting. Carmen came in and said, "Oh, we got new stuff," and I was like, I was on FloridaRealtors.org and realized that there was nothing there. I'm like, every other time when they update or present a new documentation, yeah, they present a new document. It's on FloridaRealtors.org. It's right there, new docs, right? No. So I ended up having to go into Carmen's office and go, "Where did you get those?" "Oh, it was emailed to us." Oh, okay. So anyway, thank you, Carmen. I think Bryce had chimed in as well on our WhatsApp chat. So thank you, Bryce, wherever you are today.
And that's how I found out about it first. So we do appreciate that whenever we learn something and we try to get it out to everybody. It's much appreciated. That's how I found out about it, was Bryce's post.
Oh yeah, it's like, oh, new stuff. So I went on board to find it, and this is good because these are in answer to some of the other questions we had. So I'm going to do a share screen and just bring them up. I've loaded them. They're already in our dot loop templates, and so we could just kind of review them real quick. Ooh, I think the explanations they gave in the email were pretty decent, which helped me even just try to figure out why two. Why do we have to have both? But I realized that also sometimes the people that devise these are they're ignorant of all the facts, right? So you have
they're not practicing.
Well, exactly. They're definitely not practicing. They're not having the conversations that we're having with all the people that are involved. So with that in mind, I'll look at the FF. Now, if you go to an as-is contract and you're going to write an offer, generally you would go, it's down in section 19, and most of us don't. And just as for the newer agents, and I'm going to kind of throw this out. Section 19, when you are looking at your addenda, right? Here in section 19, we've got our condo rider, and we've got our homeowners HOA. Oh, this is FHA financing. We get okay. These all take place. These are all, one or more of these may be part of my contract. Understand this, for our newer agents, when you check the box, that means there has to be a corresponding addendum document that is attached and sent with this. So if you have an HOA and you've got an FHA and you're putting in an appraisal contingency or whatever it is you happen to be, and it's pre-1978, so you got a lead-based paint disclosure, don't just check the box. Make sure you have the accompanying document that goes with it. Some of these are already in your loop template. Lead-based paint is, HOA, very common, FHA, yes. Some of them are not.
But every one of them are in dot loop, so the name is there, and all you have to do is just go look them up in the Florida Interactive.
Yes. And in this particular instance, the newest addenda that are added are FF and GG. And you notice here it stops at EE. So at some point we may see an update to this, but don't panic. If you don't see the addendum that you're trying to add, you just click on Other, and you put in your FF or GG, whatever that happens to be, and you can actually write it in here. If you need the larger box, you could put it in here. FF would be credit related to buyer broker compensation. So you could type that all in here. You'd be good. Okay, so that aside, I know I'm not going to say. Let's look at FF. I want to review and what they sent. What I think is wrong with this. Let's go out and wait. So The FF, now, because we've already given this some forethought, matter of fact, this opened up a lot of conversations with the lender. The way this is written is that the broker may offer, sorry, the seller may be offering some compensation, right? A lot of times they'll say, offering X number of dollars concessions. We know they took the concessions out, but that they did put some amount. You are allowed to put seller concessions now in the public remarks or in the realtor remarks or both. Now, you can direct those concessions. You can redirect those concessions as fit. So let's just go through this real quick. Buyer has entered into a separate brokerage agreement as may be amended, which is not incorporated herein by reference. That's whatever legalese with, and that's the name of the brokerage. So we have a buyer-broker agreement with Ameritine Realty. At closing, the seller agrees to credit the buyer the sums described below. So, okay, you could say that you've got a prearranged agreement that there's going to be compensation of a percentage of purchase price already locked down. It's the next paragraph that kind of gets me. In the event that the credit described above exceeds the amount allowed by the buyer's lender. So we know.
Alan, can you go ahead and zoom? Can you go up to the three dots in the upper right and zoom in on that document so we can read it a little bit better?
Let me see if three dots in the upper right where?
And just your browser window, just where you were. Just go back to where you were. Show us the document. Yeah, that'll work. That accomplished the same thing. Well, I was just trying to be able to read it a little bit better. Thank you.
Cool. Right. So we have okay, there's a buyer broker agreement with Ameritine Realty, and at closing, seller agrees to credit the buyer the sums below. So, and that this is which is disclosed purpose for the parties agree that the buyer's obligation under the buyer broker agreement to pay all or a portion of the buyer broker's compensation. All right. So the seller's offering 2.5% to the buyer's broker. You put your 2.5% in here and you're good to go. In the event the credit described above exceeds the amount allowed by the buyer's lender, here's the thing. When it comes to buyer-broker agreements compensation, we already know that these are not going to impact any limitation that the buyer may have. So we've talked about them for independent party contributions, IPC, I think that's what they're called. So under FHA, you can ask for up to 6% toward credit toward closing costs and prepaids. You can ask for an additional 2% on top of that or some percentage to pay down points. And you can ask for an additional amount of money to compensate the buyer. None of them interfere with the other. So there is no real limitation. You can actually leave this blank by leaving it blank. So the seller will check one. If no box is checked, then the balance of the credit will be paid by the seller. Shouldn't be an issue. It should never be an issue. So I don't necessarily love this form. This rider FF shall not modify the buyer-broker agreement or any other compensation agreement. That's fine. It just says that whatever you've agreed to here, it doesn't change what you already have in agreement with your buyer-broker, right? So you have a buyer-broker agreement, and maybe your buyer-broker agreement's for 3%, seller's offering 2.5%. That means technically your buyer is still on the hook for the other half a point. Any questions? Now, I will tell you, this would be a prearranged agreement, and one of the things that I don't like about this one is it doesn't offer the contingency. And what I mean by that is when you look at the other form that gave us, the GG, it makes it contingent. So this would be, in this contract here, let me blow it up a little bit. This contract is contingent upon the seller's broker and the buyer's broker, or the seller and the buyer's broker executing a compensation agreement with terms acceptable to the buyer. So the buyer is under contract with a buyer broker agreement for 3%, and you're putting an offer together. So what you're doing is, rather than putting that amount in the offer, you're just saying that the contract is contingent on the seller's broker and buyer's broker offering and executing a compensation agreement with terms acceptable to the buyer within X number of days. Default's 3 days. I'd put 1. You're going to receive the offer. I'd almost put 0. I don't know if you could put 0. I'd want I don't want after effective date. I want it agreed upon, like right up front. If the compensation agreement described herein is not executed and delivered within the time period, then the buyer may within 3 days. Now, here's the rub. The buyer may within 3 days thereafter deliver a written notice to the seller, terminating the contract. So, it does give you a little time to negotiate what it should be and what you'd want it to be. I'd want it executed right away. But what this does do is it puts it in control of the buyer. Knowing the buyer knowing he has a written agreement with you, he knows he's got a written agreement to pay you 3%. He's looking for compensation or credit for you to that 3%. So there is a negotiation there, but it does make the contract contingent. I like it a little better. So if you already know up front what the amount's going to be, you can use the other one, attach the FF, put in the numbers that are all agreed upon, attach it to, make sure that when you're doing your as-is contract, you put in that FF. Generally, if you attach something to a contract, they are all part of the same contract. So there you go. And that's kind of how they described it. When you look at the email they got, the GG, this form may be used by the buyer to make the contract contingent. I like that contingency. I want it contingent. The other form can be used when the seller has already agreed. I already agreed this is what it's going to be. You fill it in, you attach it, you send it off as part of the offer. That's fine too. A lot of times what ends up happening is we get an executed main part of the contract and the addendums aren't executed. If the addendums aren't signed, you don't have a complete contract. You don't. So if you check the box and you attach them and you only got the signed main portion, but none of the addendums are signed, you do not have a complete contract. Just keep that in mind.
Alan, I just wanted to, I was curious because you said that one was contingent and one was not. I was just taking a quick peek at the FF, and that is actually between the buyer and the seller, not the agents. And so therefore, as part of the contract, it's contingent in being part of the contract.
That's true. Yeah,
does that make sense?
True. If you check the box, and you fill it in and you attach it.
Yeah. And
right?
so the one that involves us in some way or another, the brokers, that's the one that has that added the added text that makes it contingent, because we're not actually part of the primary contract between the buyer and the seller. So FF is between buyer and seller, so it doesn't need that terminology, whereas the brokers being involved, or there being some kind of agreement outside of the two parties, that's why they have to put that verbiage in there.
And that's always been the attempt. People do not like to see everything has been stressed to show that the agreement, any contract, is always between the buyer and the seller. It's always. So that's why when the seller is crediting, and we went through this, I went through this with lender, when the seller is giving credits to the buyer toward closing costs and prepaids, that's still between the buyer and the seller. And what they're trying to do is keep us out of it, kind of at arm's length. But now this is their way, as opposed to the lengthy, cut and paste statement that I have, or we put together for additional terms, and then attaching a compensation agreement. What they're saying now is, if you attach a GG, you have to negotiate and get that compensation agreement executed. And as long as you're good, then we can move forward. So this is their approach to making sure that the buyer broker is getting compensated, sort of making it the contract contingent upon that. But we're still an interested third party, if you will.
Currently, as of September 11th, 2024, my broker, which do you prefer we use if we were to sign something today? Do you prefer us use the text verbiage that you provided us with, or do you prefer we use one of these?
I like the text verbiage, but here's the issue. What I like and what other brokers like and will or will not accept is the key issue. We want our contracts to be accepted. So that being said, we might have an insistence upon, hey, I want a FAR-BAR contract with FAR-BAR addenda. So if you have a conversation, if you have a conversation with the listing agent up front, and you can get a signed compensation agreement, that's great. You got your signed compensation agreement. Go ahead and use FF. Right? I've got this, and I'm going to do this, and FF is fine. It kind of ties it all together because everything's already been predetermined and agreed upon. But if you're putting in a blind offer because you can't get in touch with the listing agent, or the listing agent kind of looked at you and said, well, depending on the strength of your offer, that's how much the seller may or may not offer the buyer's broker, then you're going to use.
I want 10% then.
Yeah, and we'll argue down. You can probably negotiate me down to 7. I like it. I like it. So now this is putting the pressure on the buyer. The GG will put the pressure on the buyer to make the decision. He has a contract, the buyer broker agreement signed with you for 3%. Seller, after negotiating, they've accepted everything except for the fact that the seller's only going to pay 2, and that's a conversation between you and the buyer. Kind of puts you, in that position where you're either going to have to renegotiate and modify your buyer broker agreement, or your buyer's going to have to cough up an extra point. So that's where this puts us with all of this. You know what? With the FF, just make sure you have a signed compensation agreement, and then you can attach an FF to the contract and have just there's nothing wrong with having more than one way to express the numbers. Just make sure it's all together. Make sure it all makes sense.